you're off the clock. The surroundings are quiet, predictable, and secure. Tonight's story is steady and unhurried, ideal for letting go and drifting off. Nothing shifts. Nothing calls for attention. Let's begin. I remember the sound of the crawler more than anything. Not the gunfire, not the screaming, not the static in my ear. Just the slow, grinding churn of its tracks through the swamp. A heavy, patient noise that never changed, no matter what we were crushing under our weight. Mud, twisted steel, bodies. It all sounded the same by the end. The world we were on did not have a name that mattered to me. There was a designation in my briefing slate, a string of letters and numbers, but it never settled in my head. To me, it was just the drowned farm, the place where they tried to grow food and instead grew something else. When the tide pulled back, you could see what it used to be. Rows of raised soil now dissolved into gray sludge, broken irrigation towers leaning like snapped bones, silos cut in half by water lines and corrosion. We moved through it at low tide because that was the only time we could. The water lapped just below my knees where my suit seals had been repaired too many times. It carried a smell that never left the filters, sour metal, decay, and the faint sweetness of rotting starch. Over everything lay smoke from the smaller burns behind us, where other columns had passed and made their crude attempts at cleaning. I was attached to incineration column 9, though the number changed depending on which chart of command you listened to. It was a simple arrangement on paper. Infantry forward, infantry on the flanks, drones overhead, and in the center, the furnace crawler. A hulking machine that ate anything fed into its maw and exhaled ash and hot, dirty air from its rear vents. It had its own power supply, a belly full of fuel, and a crew sealed deep inside its armored shell. We were there to keep things from reaching that shell. My task within the column was to keep the people around me breathing and moving. Field Medic ISE 73. The designation felt heavier than my armor sometimes. My exosuit was lighter than the line troops, but I carried more than they did. Med packs strapped across my chest and hips, injector modules stacked along my left forearm, a thermal cutter locked to my thigh, and a small carbine that I tried very hard not to think about unless I had to. We had already been moving for hours before the day really began. The sky stayed the same gray color whether it was morning or evening. You could only tell time by the height of the water and the pattern of our own exhaustion. My knee had started its familiar complaints after the first hour, sending small electric aches up my thigh whenever we took a slope or a submerged step. I acknowledged it, logged it mentally, and moved on. It was one more pain in a crowded room. The enemy watched us long before they attacked. You could see them along the edges of our route if you bothered to look. At first they resembled piles of debris, rounded shapes clothed in slime and sediment, lodged against the bases of broken towers or in the hollows of collapsed root beds. Only when the crawler's vibration rolled through the water did they start to move. The mud on them cracked. Spines unfolded from their hides, rising and angling as if to taste the air. They were not large individually, about the size of a big dog back home, compact, heavy. Their musculature was wrong, concentrated in the shoulders and back, built for short, violent bursts of motion. The rest of them was weapon. Their bodies were studded with spines that lay flat until they were ready to fight. When those spines came up, you saw the shine of hard material beneath the muck, all pointing outward like a forest of knives waiting to be fired. We learned early on that they did not need to reach us physically to kill us. They could empty themselves at range. The first time I saw them do it, weeks before the column mission, I thought some new kind of artillery had arrived. All along a berm, dozens of them tightened and spasmed, and suddenly the air was full of streaks, thin objects moving too fast to track, hammering into armor and soil. That was how we found out what their spines were for. By the time I joined the column, none of that was new. We had protocols. Keep spacing. Stay within overlapping fields of fire. Let the drones flush the packs before they build up too much mass at the flanks. Clear any penetrations immediately. Remove spines within 30 seconds if possible. Burn contaminated gear within minutes. Burn contaminated bodies within an hour. The hatching times were shorter than anyone liked. On the day we pushed toward the agro-colony hub, the world felt more crowded than usual. Not just with our own people and machines, but with a kind of invisible pressure. Static scratched constantly in our ears as comms tried and failed to stabilize. The air above the swamp shimmered with heat from distant burn lines, and low clouds of ash drifted in and out of view, trailing slowly across the sky like bruises. I walked on the right side of the crawler, close enough to feel its vibration in my boots. The ground under me was a mixture of metal plates from long ruined roads and the softer resistance of mud where those plates had sunk. Every step had to be placed deliberately. A misjudged patch could swallow your foot up to the knee, and time spent extracting yourself was time without fire covering the angles. The first sign that something was different came from above. We were used to the empty sky. Drones prowled up there when they could, small specks orbiting and adjusting, but otherwise it was open. The predators lived in the water and on the ground. They did not climb. They did not fly. That was our assumption when the campaign started, and even after the first mutations we mostly kept it. I noticed the shapes sometime after we crossed a stretch of broken pipeline. The crawler had to slow to thread between the jagged metal arcs, and so did we. That gave me a moment to look up instead of down. There were objects hanging in the air that didn't belong. They were small at that distance, just darker knots against the gray, moving slowly. Not like drones, they lacked the clean, purposeful arcs of machines. These things shifted and drifted, rising a little, falling a little, letting the currents of heated air from distant fires carry them. At first I thought they were debris, shredded sacks of something toxic rising from the burns. One of the infantry ahead of me pointed their weapon upward in a way that said they had noticed too. Another adjusted their stance, spreading their feet, angling their visor. The crawler kept moving. The sound of the tracks did not change. We kept going. The enemy on the ground paced us almost lazily. I saw them through gaps in the wreckage, rounded forms half submerged, spines still flat against their hides, eyes like wet stones fixed on our profiles. Occasionally, one of them would rise to higher ground, testing its footing on collapsed walls or the rusted ribs of fallen towers. It was as though they understood we were going towards something important and wanted to follow. We were still several kilometers from the hub when the first airborne one came down. I didn't see the dive begin. I heard the impact. It was a heavy, wet crash against armor somewhere toward the front of the column, followed by a sound I had learned to recognize too well, the staccato drumming of spines hitting metal at speed. Not from dozens of different bodies spaced along a berm, but from one source, concentrated and intimate. My HUD flashed contamination markers from ahead, multiple soup breaches, irregular biosignatures. By the time I pushed through the column's staggered line to reach the injured, the thing that hit us was already dead. It lay twisted across the remnants of an old guardrail, its body split open along one side where the impact had been too much even for its armor. It was one of them, but wrong. The core structure was the same, heavy frame, dense musculature, spine fields along its back and flanks. But attached to that core were new growths. Sagging bladders of translucent tissue clung to its sides, still twitching with leftover reflexes. Thin, ragged membranes spread from those bladders, torn in several places, as if something had tried to turn limbs into wings and had only partially succeeded. The spines on this one were thicker, too, and hollow. Its body was empty of them. The remains of its spine beds were just open pits, like the sockets of pulled teeth. Whatever it had carried inside had been expelled on impact. The armor of the soldier it hit told the rest of the story. His chest plate was a forest of quivering shafts, most stopped by the composite, but some sunk deep where plates joined, in the soft armor beneath the arms and between the collar pieces. Others had found the thinner back plates, driven in at angles that suggested ricochet or rebound. The ones that had penetrated were already changing. I knelt beside him and felt for responses through my gauntlet. There were some at first, twitching, shallow breaths rattling through the suit's speakers. His heart rate bounced wildly on my HUD, then began to smooth, then to slow. The spines were not just stationary objects embedded in flesh. They were active. At each point where one had sunk deep, the tissue around it was swelling, rising like dough under heat. The spines themselves were pulsing slowly, a faint rhythm that did not match his heartbeat. I had done this before on smaller scales. Isolate the area, cut, extract, burn, move on. The problem here was mass. Too many points of entry, too much of him already turned into a nursery. My fingers moved without conscious thought. I sealed what I could, injected suppressants at overlapping sites, tried to slow circulation in the limb most affected. I cut 2 spines free, driving them into a containment pouch that writhed immediately. The third time I went in, my cutter met resistance I did not expect. The spine had already flowered inside him, its tip split into a fan of barbs anchored to muscle and bone. His vitals were dropping. Protocol was clear. I reached for one of the incineration charges clipped to my belt. My hand did not shake. It had the first time I did this, it did not anymore. We burned him where he lay, on the broken road, with his armor still sealed around him. The charge fused his outer plates together and turned the inside into something I did not let myself think about. The heat warped the rail beside him. The smell pushed through my filters harder than the swamp ever had. We moved on. The sky did not empty after that. The drifting shapes multiplied. They stayed high at first, testing. Drones shifted their patterns to get better angles, but the air above us was murky with steam and ash, and target locks slipped easily. The next dives came in pairs, then in clusters. Each one followed the same pattern. A slow, meandering descent, a sudden folding of the membranes, a drop, a brief acceleration, and then a terminal crash into the column, right at the edges where armor was thinnest or where people had to stand exposed to cover some angle. The moment of impact was almost always fatal to the attacker. The moment after impact was why they did it. Spine storms at close range did things to armor our designs had never anticipated. Once or twice we had a good angle, and a burst of concentrated fire shredded an incoming shape before it reached us. Even then, fragments of its spines carried through the air with the shock and embedded in whoever happened to be standing nearby. Every time someone went down, I ran. Sometimes I got there in time to cut and cauterize, sometimes I didn't. More burns followed in the road, on collapsed catwalks, against leaning tower bases. The number of glowing markers on my HUD increased. Contaminated. 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 A growing field of red among the green. The column's rhythm began to falter. The crawler kept moving because it had to. If it stopped, we would all die around it. The infantry tried to maintain spacing, but constant adjustments to cover overhead angles pulled us tighter together. The drones spent more time firing up than out, which left the ground packs along our flanks more room to creep closer. I saw them taking advantage of it. They surged in small groups whenever the column slowed to pick its way past some obstacle. Their bodies rolled and lunged through the water, spines rising, and then the air was filled with the hiss of projectiles. The impacts on our lower plates made a sound like heavy rain on a roof. Most of those spines bounced, glanced off, or lodged in non-critical fittings. Enough found gaps to make my job steady and relentless. I moved in a rotation that felt like a ritual. Check seals, cut spines, patch holes, assess vitals, decide if a charge was necessary, move on. No one asked me whether a charge was necessary. That was part of the unwritten protocol. If someone was contaminated badly enough that I was holding an incinerator, everyone around us already knew. We were less than 2 kilometers from the hub when the wider war collided with us. Up to that point, the campaign had existed for me as short, broken reports in my ear. Columns here, burn lines there, floodgates opening on some distant canal. A messy patchwork of operations, each with its own priorities. Our part was clear enough. Reach the agro-colony furnace grid and tie our crawler into it. Use the old infrastructure to multiply our burn capacity. Somewhere else, someone's job was to drive swarms of the predators into pre-planned kill zones with controlled floods. We were supposed to skirt the edge of one such operation. That was what the route projections in my slate had shown. By the time we got there, everything was out of sync. The first sign was the water level. It began to rise faster than the tide schedule predicted, pushing against our legs with new force. Bitter-smelling currents flowed at odd angles across our path. The mud under my boots softened further, making each step a negotiation. Our exosuits adjusted, servos compensating, but the added resistance translated directly into muscle fatigue. Then came the sound. The swarm being driven ahead of the flood moved as one organism. You could hear it before you saw it, a layered scraping and sloshing, punctuated by the occasional thunder of many spines firing in chorus. The noise grew louder with each meter we advanced, until it was a constant roar threaded with sharper impacts. My HUD tried to build a picture from scattered sensor inputs, but it failed in the narrow channel we were following. We were surrounded on both sides by high mounds of collapsed infrastructure, broken walls, the remains of greenhouses, overturned storage tanks. They formed a crude canyon around us. Above, the sky narrowed to a strip of gray framed by rust. We were moving through a funnel. At the far end of that funnel, the floodwaters and the swarm converged. The forward elements of the column reached that convergence first. I saw them disappear around a bend in the channel, silhouettes shrinking against the hunched shapes of ruined buildings. The crawler continued to advance, its tracks grinding at a steady pace, pushing a wave of murky water ahead. The sound hit us next. It was not like previous engagements. Those had been sharp, localized fights. Bursts of gunfire, individual packs of predators, discrete volleys of spines. This was a continuous collision of matter. The swarm, the flood, the forward platoons, all coming together in a space too small for any of them. Gunfire hammered off the walls in thick, overlapping bursts. Spines rattled and clawed at metal. Distant human voices clipped by comm failures flickered in my ear, cut off mid-syllable by static or something worse. The channel filled with bodies. They came floating back to us, pushed by the rising water and by the sheer pressure of movement at the front. Armor, twisted and opened. Predators, bloated and ripped apart. Unidentifiable chunks of biomass. The water around my knees thickened, turning into something more like slurry than liquid. Each step forward meant pushing through that slurry, feeling pieces of things slide along the greaves of my suit. We advanced because the crawler advanced. There was nowhere else to go. Retreat in that canyon would have meant piling up behind the furnace until we could no longer move, and then the airborne ones would have plucked us apart at their leisure. When I reached the bend, I understood what the flood operation had done to us. The channel widened there into a shallow basin, once a staging ground between storage fields. The floodgates further up had opened early or at the wrong angle. Instead of driving the predators into a carefully planned kill zone, the water had taken whatever path it could carve. It shoved them into that basin and held them there. A boiling mass of bodies stacked over each other, climbing over metal and over us. The forward platoons were buried under it. I saw hands reaching up, the backs of helmets, fragments of unit markings. I saw predators clinging to them, using armor as purchase as they fired spines into joints and neck seals. The air above the basin was thick with airborne forms, drifting down, diving, exploding into showers of spines and blood and water. The firing line had collapsed into pockets. Small groups of surviving soldiers stood on whatever high ground they could find. Rooftops, the tops of toppled silos, even the backs of the crawler's outer plating, pouring fire into the swarm at point-blank range. The crawler itself had pushed halfway into the basin and then slowed, tracks grinding against a bottom made of bodies instead of earth. I do not remember moving in those first seconds. One moment I was at the lip of the basin, staring. The next, I was in it, water at my waist, cutting spines out of someone whose face I did not recognize. There is no reliable sequence to what happened next. Just impressions. Hands on my suit, attempts to pull me away from someone I was trying to save. The sensation of spines glancing off my shoulders and helmet, some finding seams in my thigh plates and lodging there, sending numbness into my leg. The dull shock of something heavy hitting the crawler's flank, followed by a wave of heat from its vents as the overloaded systems tried to compensate. I know I applied more incineration charges in that basin than I had in the entire campaign up to that point, some on soldiers who were already dead, to keep what was inside them from hatching in the middle of the column, some on predators that had fused with armor and would not let go. Something in me narrowed down to a series of decisions. This one might live if I cut fast enough. This one will not. This one is already more of them than us. When the order came to continue toward the hub by a different route, I barely registered it as speech. It arrived as a shift in movement around me. The survivors were turning away from the basin's center, dragging themselves up along the sides toward a ramp of collapsed containers that led into a higher, narrower channel. The crawler reversed, backing out of the worst of the bodies with a grinding screech. For a moment, I thought it would stall completely, tracks spinning uselessly. Then the pile under it gave way, and it surged backward into clearer water, leaving a churned mound behind. I climbed out after it, slipping and hauling myself hand over hand on exposed rebar. My knee betrayed me once, sending a spike of pain up my leg that made my vision blur, but the suit's assist took some of the load and kept me upright. We regrouped as a diminished thing. The column was no longer a full formation. It was a cluster of damaged exosuits around a machine that had lost some of its outer plating and listed slightly to one side. The drone swarm overhead was thin and ragged. Several feeds on my HUD were just blank squares. The new route took us along a raised accessway that used to serve maintenance crews. It clung to the side of a long storage block, segments of metal grating bolted to brackets that had not been checked in decades. The water beneath it churned with debris and drifting predator bodies, some still twitching. Overhead, the airborne variants followed. Their behavior had changed since the first dive. They were no longer just opportunistic. They were coordinated. They spread themselves along our path at regular intervals, drifting down just enough to hover within striking distance, waiting. When the column reached a gap in the drone coverage, or a point where the accessway narrowed and forced us closer together, they dropped. We lost 2 more soldiers before we cleared that stretch, both to impacts that battered them off the walkway and into the water below, where ground packs waited. I could not reach them in time. Their biosigns flared briefly, then went dark. At some point during that passage, I noticed that the crawler's ignition readings were wrong. My HUD carried a limited feed from its systems, enough to let me know whether we would have fuel when we reached the hub. The numbers were unstable. The ignition matrix had suffered damage, likely from a spine cluster punching through outer housings. Fuel line pressure fluctuated beyond safe margins. If we tied it directly into the hub furnace grid in that state, there was a non-trivial chance it would detonate instead of integrate. That would still accomplish some kind of burn, but it would be localized and uncontrolled. I flagged the data, pushed it into the fragmentary command net, and received nothing coherent back. Just overlapping orders, corrections, acknowledgments for messages I had not sent. The atmosphere was interfering more with each meter we advanced. By the time the hub came into view, the world around us had shrunk to a series of immediate tasks. The agro-colony hub had once been a node of efficiency. That much you could tell even through the corrosion and damage. Silos rose in concentric circles around a central chimney, all connected by pipes and conveyor housings. Loading platforms jutted out at different levels, some partially submerged. The circular design had been meant to optimize flow, grain in, waste out, nothing wasted. Now those same channels had filled with something else. The predators had claimed every horizontal surface they could reach. Their bodies carpeted loading decks and clung to the sides of silos, packed so densely that individual shapes were hard to distinguish. They nested around pipe junctions and between broken conveyor belts, their spines folded flat while they waited. Heat drew them, and the hub had plenty of residual heat from past burn attempts. Even from a distance you could feel it, a faint breath of warmth against the wet chill of the swamp. The predators shifted in restless waves whenever the wind brought them new scents or vibrations. The access to the main furnace grid lay up a ramp that spiraled around the base of the central chimney. That ramp was our target. We had to push the crawler up it. Under ideal conditions, the ramp would have been a minor obstacle. The crawler's tracks were designed for inclines. Under current conditions, with the surface slick from moisture and coated in layers of organic matter and shed spines, it became a trial. The infantry formed a wedge ahead of and around the crawler, clearing as much of the path as they could with steady fire. Each burst tore holes in the carpet of predators, but the gaps filled quickly. Bodies rolled in from the edges, spines rising. The air filled with fragments of chitin and meat and the metallic buzz of ricochet. The airborne ones gathered above the chimney, circling. They descended in timed waves, aiming for the sides and rear of the crawler, for the shoulders and backs of the soldiers covering those arcs. I saw several detonate their spines against the chimney itself, embedding egg-bearing shafts into the masonry and into old residue along its flanks. Whatever emerged there later would have to be someone else's problem. My world narrowed further to the square meter of space around each wounded body. We advanced in increments measured in burns and bandages. Someone would go down. I would reach them, cut, inject, decide. Sometimes I left them behind, a smoking bundle on the ramp. Sometimes they stood up again, patched and limping, and took their place back in the line. Somewhere along that grind, I felt the first spine sink into my own suit in a way that mattered. There had been glancing hits before, of course. Small punctures at the outer layers, quickly sealed, spines extracted by colleagues or by my own careful cuts when there was a break in the fighting. This one was different. It came from above and behind, at an angle I could not track. I felt the blunt impact at the base of my neck, followed by a sharp, invasive pressure, then heat. My HUD flashed an alert, breach at collar junction. Unknown biological. I injected a broad-spectrum suppressant into my own neck without hesitation, the injector on my wrist hissing against the suit's inner lining. Numbness radiated outward, then was replaced by a strange, deep ache. I could feel something inside the tissues exploring, pushing, testing. There was no time to address it fully. The crawler was almost at the access point when its ignition readings spiked off the chart. The inclination and the strain of the climb had put too much stress on its damaged systems. Pressure built in the lines, feeding the furnace core in unstable surges. Warning icons filled the edge of my vision. Too hot, too fast, too close to critical failure. The only way to stabilize it long enough to tie into the hub grid was manual regulation at the interface point. The access panel for that interface was mounted on an open ring-shaped platform halfway up the chimney, just wide enough for a few people and a small console. No overhead cover, minimal railings, clear lines of fire for anything circling above. The person who controlled the link would need to stand there, exposed, and modulate flows in real time as the crawler synced with the old furnace system. If they abandoned the panel too soon, surges would propagate back into the crawler and forward into the hub conduits, risking either a premature explosion or a failed ignition. There were probably volunteers. There are always volunteers in stories people tell afterward. In reality, I do not know who was chosen, if anyone chose. I know only that I was there when the crawler ground to a halt beside the platform, that my suit still functioned, and that my hands still responded when I told them to move. I stepped onto the platform because I was the one closest to it. The heat from the chimney was immediate and enveloping. It rolled up from the core below in waves, carrying with it the smell of old burns and new fuel. The console's surface was hot through my gloves. Lights flickered across its face, some steady, some spasmodic. I jacked my suit into the interface port with a cable that had not seen use in years. Data flooded my HUD in a torrent: flow rates, temperature gradients, pressure readings, structural strain maps. The crawler's unstable ignition core glowed in those readings like a wounded heart. The hub's ancient furnace grid loomed ahead, hungry but fragile. My hands moved over the controls, adjusting valves, opening some, throttling others. I could feel the crawler's crew responding with their own internal adjustments, their systems speaking to mine across the connection. Around me, the battle did not stop. The ramp below the platform remained a contested slope of fire and bodies. Predators surged up and were cut down. Airborne variants dove and were shredded, sometimes not soon enough. Spines clattered against the platform's railings, ringing out with each impact. The metal vibrated under my boots with every shot from the soldiers holding the line. One of the airborne ones tried to hit the platform directly. I saw it only as a blur in my peripheral vision, a dark knot falling out of the sky. It struck the outer edge and burst, showering the console with spines. Several of them embedded in the panel near my hands. A few struck my forearms and shoulders. My suit registered each impact, flashing new breach alerts. I injected another dose of suppressant into my bloodstream and kept my hands moving. Inside my body, the first spine's eggs had already begun to work. The ache in my neck had deepened into a throbbing, unpleasant fullness, as if something was inflating within my tissues. I could feel faint rhythms under my skin that did not match my pulse. I kept the flows stable. There's not much drama in the actual ignition of a furnace system, at least not visually. No sudden fireball, no cinematic bloom of light. It is a process. Heat builds in stages. The core reaches a threshold. Fuel in outlying channels begins to respond. In this case, the transition manifested as a subtle shift in the air around me. The heat stopped feeling like something leaking from below and started feeling intentional, directed. My HUD confirmed as much. The hub's grid indicators changed color, moving from dormant to active. Down in the fields around the silos, things began to burn. The initial reaction came from old residue, leftover fuel, dried plant matter, previous layers of enemy biomass. Those ignited quickly, sending up columns of flame that licked at the lower levels of the structures. The predators clustered there responded in confusion, their bodies twisting as the surfaces under them heated. Some tried to flee into the water. Some stayed, spines rising, firing wildly into the air as their hides blistered. The fire spread in concentric circles, moving from silo to silo, chewing through everything that could sustain it. Air currents shifted, feeding it oxygen. Ash began to fall around the platform like dark snow. The heat climbed. My suit's internal temperature warning screamed at me. I adjusted coolant flows, rerouted power to the thermal regulators, but there was only so much they could do. Sweat pooled under my inner layer and then boiled away. My vision blurred at the edges, darkening and brightening in pulses that had nothing to do with the HUD's brightness. Somewhere behind me, someone was shouting into the commnet. I could not make out the words. It might have been orders for me to disconnect. It might have been screams. The static was thick. It occurred to me then that I could step away. I could break the connection, trust the system to stabilize on its own. Maybe it would. Maybe the crawler's core would not spike. Maybe the hub's grid would not overload. Maybe we would get to live with whatever mess resulted. I stayed at the console. The enemies did not stop their attempts to reach me. Spines continued to patter against the platform and the chimney walls, sometimes at such a high rate that the metal felt like a drumhead under constant beating. The airborne ones grew fewer as the fire rose, their fragile membranes unable to cope with the heat, but the last of them still tried. One more hit the platform, this time closer. Its body slammed against the rail and slid across the grated floor, leaving a smear of fluids that hissed as they evaporated. Spines rolled free, clattering and then coming to rest near my boots. I forced myself not to step back. Inside my body, the foreign rhythms grew stronger. I could feel them in my chest now, in my shoulder, radiating out from the initial points of penetration. They pulsed in counterpoint to my heart, a dull tattoo that seemed to echo the crawler's own unstable beat as it continued to feed the hub. I knew what would come next if I stepped away. I had seen it in others. The swelling, the splitting, the emergence of new, smaller bodies from within a human frame, tearing their way out with spines firing in frantic, instinctive bursts. If that happened here on this platform, with my armor and my suit and my body loaded with their eggs, the infection would seed directly into the consoles and the junctions, into the very machinery we were using to burn them. The irony would have been neat, in a way. I would have turned the cure back into a source. I stayed where I was. Time lost granularity. It was no longer a sequence of seconds, but a stretch of heat and pressure and noise that seemed to go on without end. My hands moved because they had to. My eyes tracked numbers because that was the last thread connecting me to reason. At some point, I realized the external noise had diminished. The patter of spines decreased, then stopped. Gunfire faded from a constant roar to isolated bursts, then to nothing. The only sounds left were the deep rumble of the furnace grid and the fluttering hiss of the flames themselves, moving through the fields below. My HUD showed a stabilized pattern, flows within tolerances. The crawler's core no longer on the edge of failure, but humming in rhythm with the hub. The mission, in the narrowest sense, was accomplished. I do not remember collapsing, though I must have. The next clear image in my mind is of lying on my back on the platform, staring up at a sky that had turned almost black from smoke. Ash drifted down in slow, lazy spirals. Flames painted the underside of the clouds with a dim, bloody glow. Inside my suit, everything hurt in a distant, abstract way. The suppressant was losing its fight. My neck felt swollen and stiff. Every breath came with a crackle of something moving inside me. There were voices again, faint and crackling. Hands touched my armor. Someone tried to drag me away from the console. The connection cable snapped loose from my suit with a pop. I do not know if they succeeded in moving me from that platform, or if the memories I have of being carried into the deeper parts of the hub are just fever dreams. I remember a sense of enclosure, darker corridors, the echo of boots on metal floors. I remember someone cutting my armor away and the air on my skin feeling like fire. After that, there is nothing solid. Sometimes, in the night since, I wake up with the sensation that I am still there, that the heat is still climbing and the spines are still moving under my skin. I smell burning biomass and hear the tapping of projectiles on metal, that constant, irregular rain. They tell me the hub held, that the burn we triggered changed the map, entire breeding fields reduced to ash, swarm densities dropping along multiple fronts, the campaign shifting slowly in our favor. I accept that as fact. I have no reason to doubt it. What I cannot account for is the gap between the last thing I remember clearly and the first time I opened my eyes in a recovery bay weeks later, with scars along my neck and shoulders and a set of medical notes in my file that are mostly redacted. They say they got the eggs out. Sometimes, when I am alone and the room is quiet, I hold my breath and listen. To my heart, to the blood moving through the vessels, to the faint internal echoes that most people never notice. Every now and then, I think I hear something else layered under that. A second rhythm, very small, very slow. It might be nothing. It might be damage, a leftover misfiring of nerves. It might be my mind imposing patterns where there are none. Or it might be the world reminding me that nothing we burn ever truly goes away. It just changes shape and waits. When I remember the crawl through the swamp and the climb up the ramp, I do not feel pride. I feel tired. My body carries the memory in its own way, in the stiffness of my knee when the weather shifts, in the faint itch under the scar at the base of my neck. The sound that returns most often is still not the fire, or the screaming, or the spines. It is the crawler grinding its way forward through everything we put in front of it, the steady, unchanging churn of tracks over ground indifferent to what they were crushing. The campaign goes on. The furnace grid burns. The maps look cleaner than they did. Inside me, the echoes remain. The end. The narrative releases its hold, leaving only calm behind. Nothing approaches, nothing shifts. Stay in this moment as long as you like.